The mind behind the weapon, the Suomi KP-31, and the innovators who mastered close-quarter winter combat. The metallic click echoed through the frozen workshop like a prayer answered. Imo Lahti held the drum magazine in both hands, feeling its weight, nearly a kilogram when loaded with 71 rounds of 9mm ammunition. Outside the frosted windows of the Tikkakoski factory, December wind rattled the panes, carrying with it rumors of Soviet troop movements along the border. Finland had perhaps days, perhaps hours, before the war everyone knew was coming would finally arrive. The weapon on the workbench before him looked deceptively simple. The Suomi KP-31 submachine gun, just over 4 kilograms of blued steel and carefully machined parts, represented 20 years of obsession compressed into a design that most military planners still considered a tactical curiosity. Lahti ran his calloused fingers along the receiver, feeling the precision of tolerances measured in hundredths of millimeters. Every surface told a story of failure, adjustment, and stubborn persistence against a military establishment that believed bolt-action rifles were the only serious weapons infantry needed. He lifted the drum, aligned the feeding lips, and pushed it home. The mechanism locked with that satisfying click, the sound of complexity functioning as simplicity. 71 rounds ready to fire without reloading, 71 chances to suppress an enemy squad, to buy the seconds that separated living soldiers from dead ones. But only if the weapon worked, when the temperature dropped to 40 below zero and diesel fuel froze solid in engine blocks. The tactical problem was brutally simple. Soviet doctrine relied on massed infantry assaults, waves of men advancing under artillery and armor support, overwhelming defenders through sheer numbers. Finland's defense forces understood they would face this human tide with perhaps one-third the manpower, primitive anti-tank capabilities, and an industrial base that could barely equip its existing soldiers, much less produce weapons at the scale modern war demanded. Traditional bolt-action rifles required 4 to 5 seconds between shots. A skilled rifleman could fire perhaps 15 aimed rounds per minute under ideal conditions. Against Soviet infantry, attacking through winter forests where visibility dropped to meters and combat happened at ranges measured in paces rather than hundreds of yards, those 4 seconds meant death. The Finns needed weapons that could deliver overwhelming firepower at close range, that could turn a single squad into a force multiplier capable of holding ground against numerically superior attackers. But firepower meant nothing if the weapon froze. Lahti walked to the firing range at the back of the facility, the Suomi cradled in his arms like something fragile despite its brutal purpose. The range master, Oskar Nieminen, looked up from his logbook with the weary expression of a man who'd witnessed too many promising designs fail their first real test. Snow had drifted against the sandbag positions overnight. The temperature gauge read -28 Celsius. "Testing again?" Nieminen asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "The last batch seized up after 30 rounds. Different lubricant," Lahti said quietly. "Different spring tension in the drum. It will work." "They all work in the workshop," Nieminen observed, pulling on heavy gloves. "It's the field that kills them." Lahti said nothing. He'd heard variations of this conversation 100 times from procurement officers, senior engineers, fellow designers who'd abandoned submachine gun development as a dead end. The Thompson cost more than a quality rifle and jammed in mud. The German MP-18 worked adequately but couldn't handle extended firing sequences without overheating. Drums were particularly troublesome. The spring mechanisms required to lift 70 rounds against gravity while maintaining consistent feeding pressure exceeded what existing metallurgy could reliably produce. The first Suomi prototypes had literally exploded during testing when the spring tension became too great. He loaded a fresh drum, the rounds clicking into place with mechanical precision. The weapon felt right in his hands, balanced, purposeful. The weight distributed exactly as he'd calculated. But feeling right and working right were different things. And soldiers would die if he'd miscalculated. The Suomi roared to life with a sound like tearing canvas. Short, controlled bursts, just as he'd envisioned. Not the wild spray of undisciplined automatic fire, but precise applications of overwhelming firepower. 3-round bursts, pause, adjust aim, fire again. The drum fed smoothly, each round stripping from the magazine and chambering without hesitation. 30 rounds, 40, 50. At 65 rounds, the bolt locked open, empty, no malfunctions, no freezing. The weapon had functioned flawlessly at nearly 30 degrees below zero. Nieminen walked down range, examined the target, then returned with an expression Lahti couldn't quite read. "Tight groups," he said slowly. "Very tight, considering the rate of fire." He paused, looking at the Suomi with new assessment. "How many prototypes did it take to get here?" 17, Lahti said, counting the ones that exploded, but even success at -28 didn't answer the real question. Could the Suomi function at -50? Could it work after being buried in snow, dragged through frozen mud, handled by soldiers whose fingers were numb inside heavy gloves? Could it sustain fire in combat conditions where adrenaline, fear, and the chaos of close-quarter fighting turned careful range procedures into desperate improvisation? And more troubling, would Finland's military leadership accept what the weapon represented? A fundamental challenge to infantry doctrine that had governed warfare since smokeless powder replaced black. Submachine guns meant close-range tactics, aggressive maneuvering, accepting casualties to get within the weapon's effective range. The High Command still thought in terms of disciplined volleys at 400 meters, not stormtrooper rushes through winter forests where the fight was won or lost in the first 10 seconds. Lahti had built a weapon for a war the generals didn't want to acknowledge Finland would have to fight. If stories like this make you question what you do when everyone says you're wrong, but you know you're right, tell us in the comments and stay with us for the next chapters. How long can you fight for something when everyone says you're wrong? The reports from the border grew more urgent through late November. Soviet divisions massing at Terijoki, artillery positioning along the Karelian Isthmus, reconnaissance aircraft violating Finnish airspace with increasing boldness. The diplomatic situation had deteriorated beyond salvage. Stalin demanded territorial concessions Finland couldn't grant without surrendering its strategic depth, and everyone with eyes understood that refusal meant war. Finland's military planners ran the numbers with grim realism. The Red Army deployed approximately 450,000 troops along the border, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces that Finnish forces couldn't hope to match. Against this, Finland could field perhaps 180,000 men, many of them reservists called up from farms and factories, equipped with whatever weapons the limited defense budget had managed to procure over the preceding decade. The asymmetry was crushing. Soviet doctrine emphasized overwhelming force applied along broad fronts. The lessons of the Russian Civil War and recent operations in Spain and Poland synthesized into operational art that assumed material and numerical superiority. Finnish defensive doctrine, by necessity, accepted that conventional resistance would fail. The forests, the lakes, the brutal winter, these would have to become weapons themselves, and Finnish soldiers would need tools designed for the war Finland would actually fight. Not the war military tradition said ought to be fought, but tradition died hard. Lahti had learned this lesson repeatedly over the past 2 decades. He'd been born in Viala in 1896, when Finland was still a Grand Duchy within the Russian Empire, and modern automatic weapons were experimental curiosities. His father operated a small blacksmith shop, the kind of marginal enterprise that provided enough to eat, but nothing extra, where children learned their trade through observation and necessity rather than formal apprenticeship. When his father died, Amo was 12, barely old enough to understand the permanence of death. The family's economic situation became precarious. The blacksmith's skills passed to the son through muscle memory and repetition, the feel of hot metal under the hammer. The sound that indicated proper temperature for forging, the way steel held memory of how it was worked, how rushing the process produced brittleness that would reveal itself only under stress. These weren't lessons from textbooks, but truths learned through burned fingers and ruined workpieces, and the quiet satisfaction of getting it right after failing a dozen times. The Finnish Civil War in 1918 transformed these childhood lessons into something else entirely. Lahti fought with the White Forces, experiencing combat's intimate brutality in a way that peacetime engineering could never prepare someone for. He watched men die, fumbling to reload bolt-action rifles in close quarters. Saw how the precious seconds required to work a bolt-action became an eternity, when enemies were meters away instead of hundreds of meters downrange. The war's aftermath left him with questions that wouldn't quiet. Why did infantry doctrine still assume combat at rifle range when modern warfare increasingly happened at distances where you could see your enemy's face? Why did military planners treat automatic weapons as specialty tools rather than fundamental infantry arms? The answers, when he asked them, always circled back to cost, to tradition, to the comfortable assumption that the next war would resemble the last one. So he joined Finland's small weapons development program with a mission that felt almost religious in its intensity: create a submachine gun that wouldn't fail when everything else did. The early years had been exercises in sophisticated failure. His first prototypes used 20-round box magazines because that's what existing designs favored. But 20 rounds meant frequent reloading, and frequent reloading meant exposure, vulnerability, death. He needed 70-80 rounds in a single magazine, which meant a drum mechanism, which meant spring tensions that existing metallurgy couldn't safely contain. The first drum magazine prototype exploded during testing in 1922. The spring, compressed to lift 71 rounds of 9mm ammunition, released its energy catastrophically when the feeding mechanism jammed. Lahti had been standing 15 meters away. The rangemaster had refused to allow further drum testing for 6 months. But Lahti understood something about failure that distinguished him from more cautious engineers. Every failed prototype taught lessons more valuable than successful tests. The explosion revealed the limits of single-spring designs. It showed him that distributing tension across multiple springs with carefully calculated resistance curves might work where brute force failed. He spent 3 years developing the dual-spring system that would eventually make the Suomi's 71-round drum feasible. 3 years of calculations, material testing, incremental adjustments measured in fractions of millimeters. His colleagues questioned whether the entire effort was viable. Why not accept 20-round magazines like everyone else? Why pursue a design that might never work? Because soldiers deserved better, Lahti thought, but rarely said aloud. Because the next war wouldn't wait for engineers to perfect their designs at leisure. Because Finland would need every advantage it could create, and weapons that worked when soldiers needed them might mean the difference between national survival and occupation. The dual-spring breakthrough finally came in 1925. The magazine was heavier than ideal, nearly a kilogram when fully loaded, but it worked. Test after test, the drum fed reliably under controlled conditions. But controlled conditions weren't combat. And combat in Finland meant temperatures that turned lubricants to paste and made steel brittle as glass. The Arctic testing failures of 1938 had nearly broken him. The reports came back from Lapland in February 1938 like obituaries for Lahti's life work. Bolt assemblies frozen solid, firing pins cracked, lubricants congealed into useless paste. Of the 20 Suomi prototypes sent north for field testing, 18 had failed completely within the first week. The remaining 2 functioned intermittently, well enough to prove the basic design worked, but poorly enough to confirm that Arctic conditions would kill the weapon when soldiers most needed it. Lahti didn't sleep for 3 days after reading the failure reports. His wife, Elsa, found him in the workshop at 4 in the morning, surrounded by disassembled prototypes, metal shavings covering his workbench like snow. She didn't ask him to come to bed. She'd learned years ago that Amo carried a weight that had nothing to do with her or their children, a burden of responsibility to men who would die if he failed to solve problems most engineers would have abandoned as unsolvable. She simply brought coffee, placed it beside his elbow, and returned to the house without a word. The problem wasn't mechanical, it was chemical. Standard gun oil, formulated for temperate European climates, failed catastrophically below -30°C. The lubricant that allowed metal surfaces to slide smoothly against each other became viscous, then semi-solid, then effectively locked the moving parts in place. No amount of spring tension or precision machining could overcome lubricant that had transformed into something resembling cold honey. Lahti contacted chemists at Helsinki University, explained the problem, and listened to their initial assessment that developing a specialized low-temperature lubricant would require years of research and testing. He had months at most, perhaps weeks before the political situation forced Finland into a war it wasn't ready to fight. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping in the workshop, eating whatever Elsa or his assistants brought him. The chemists experimented with different base oils, additives, viscosity modifiers. Lahti redesigned the bolt carrier assembly to minimize surfaces requiring lubrication, replacing sliding contact with roller bearings where possible, accepting increased manufacturing complexity in exchange for cold weather reliability. His colleagues at Tikkakoski began avoiding him, not from malice, but from the uncomfortable recognition that Lahti had crossed some invisible boundary between dedication and obsession. He looked gaunt, moved with the jerky intensity of chronic sleep deprivation, spoke in short bursts, focused entirely on technical minutiae. The warm, skilled engineer they'd known had been replaced by something harder, more focused, and slightly frightening in its single-minded intensity. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. One of the university chemists, working late on an unrelated project, accidentally exposed a synthetic oil compound to extreme cold and discovered it remained fluid at temperatures that solidified conventional lubricants. The discovery was almost accidental, the kind of serendipity that looked like luck, but only appeared to those who'd created the conditions for luck to matter. Lahti reformulated the Suomi's lubricant specifications, modified the bolt carrier design one final time, and requested another Arctic field test. The procurement office initially refused. They'd wasted resources on the first test. Why throw good money after bad on a weapon system that had proven fundamentally flawed? Because the first test revealed the problem, Lahti said, standing in Colonel Victor Sundman's office, with the quiet certainty of someone who'd stopped caring about career consequences. And this test will prove the solution. Sundman looked at him with something between sympathy and irritation. Lahti, how many prototypes have you built? How many tests have we funded? At some point we have to accept that drums don't work in Finnish conditions. The Germans gave up on them. The Americans can barely make them function in summer. Why do you think you can solve what everyone else has failed to solve? Because everyone else doesn't have to fight the Red Army in forests at 50 below zero, Lahti said simply. They can accept failure. We can't. The second Arctic test took place in January 1939 near Ivalo, where temperatures routinely dropped to 60 degrees below zero, conditions that would kill an unprotected man in minutes, that froze breath before it left the mouth, that made metal painful to touch even through gloves. 20 Suomi prototypes with the modified lubricant and redesigned bolt carriers, 10,000 rounds of ammunition. A test protocol designed to simulate the absolute worst conditions Finnish soldiers might encounter. Weapons buried in snow overnight, fired immediately upon retrieval, magazines loaded and unloaded repeatedly with numb fingers inside heavy gloves, sustained firing until barrels glowed red, then allowed to cool to ambient temperature before firing again. The results arrived by telegram 6 days later. zero malfunctions. 10,000 rounds fired without a single failure to feed, failure to eject, or seized bolt assembly. Tight groupings even during sustained fire. The Suomi KP-31 had become the first submachine gun proven reliable in extreme Arctic conditions. But proving reliability wasn't the same as changing doctrine. The High Command remained unconvinced that submachine guns had strategic value. They were wasteful, inaccurate, suitable perhaps for police work, but not serious infantry operations. Long-range marksmanship, disciplined fire control, the rifle skills that had defined infantry combat since smokeless powder replaced black. These remained the foundation of military thinking. Sunman approved limited production, enough to equip some specialized units, enough to say the military had explored the option, but not enough to fundamentally alter Finland's tactical doctrine. The Suomi would remain a niche weapon, an experiment that might prove useful in certain limited circumstances. Lahti understood this was wrong. He'd created a weapon perfectly suited to Finland's only viable defensive strategy: close-range ambushes in dense forest where Soviet numerical superiority became irrelevant, where the side that delivered overwhelming firepower first would survive. But he was an engineer, not a general. His protests were noted, filed, and ignored. November 30th, 1939 would prove who'd been right. Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. What would you sacrifice to save lives no one knows you're saving? Spring and summer of 1939 passed in a strange limbo of preparation and denial. The Tikkakoski factory received orders for 4,000 Suomi submachine guns, enough to equip perhaps a quarter of Finland's active infantry if distributed broadly, or to fully arm elite ski battalions if concentrated strategically. Lahti worked with the production engineers to streamline manufacturing, accepting small compromises in finish and aesthetics in exchange for faster output and lower unit costs. Each weapon that left the factory carried a small metal tag with production details, and Lahti's initials stamped into the receiver, not from ego, but from accountability. If the Suomi failed in combat, he wanted everyone to know exactly who bore responsibility. The soldiers who received the first production weapons approached them with the cautious skepticism of men who'd seen too many promising innovations fail under field conditions. Sergeant Matti Heikkinen, a veteran of the Civil War who'd been selected to train the first Suomi-equipped ski platoon, held the weapon with obvious doubt during the initial familiarization session. "It's heavy," he observed, lifting the loaded drum magazine. "Running on skis with this much weight. Less than a bolt-action rifle with 5 20-round pouches," Lahti pointed out quietly. "And you're carrying 71 rounds in immediate reserve rather than hundreds spread across your webbing." Heikkinen worked the bolt, felt the smooth action, raised the weapon to his shoulder. The balance was good. Lahti could see him registering that. The weight distributed properly, the sights intuitive, the controls positioned for operation with heavy gloves. "Show me how it shoots," Heikkinen said. They moved to the range. Lahti loaded a fresh drum with practiced efficiency, chambered the first round, and fired a 3-second burst at a target 50 meters downrange. The Suomi's distinctive sound, sharper than the German MP-18, more controlled than the Thompson, echoed across the frozen field. Heikkinen walked to the target, examined the tight cluster of holes, returned with a different expression. "Again," he said, "but longer burst. Show me what happens when you keep the trigger down." Lahti obliged, emptying half the drum in a sustained burst that would have been impossible with any bolt-action rifle. The muzzle climb was manageable, the recoil impulse distributing across his shoulder rather than punching back with each individual shot. 71 rounds, Heikkinen said softly. "All in 10, 15 seconds. He paused, running calculations that had nothing to do with ballistics and everything to do with what those seconds meant in close combat. If the Russians come through the forests like they did in 18, if they try to overwhelm us with numbers in close terrain. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Both men understood what the Suomi represented, a tactical answer to a strategic problem that conventional weapons couldn't solve. Finland would be outnumbered, outgunned, facing an enemy that could trade casualties at ratios that would bleed any smaller force to exhaustion. But in the forests, where visibility dropped to meters and maneuver space collapsed to narrow trails and frozen bogs, a squad armed with Suomis could deliver firepower that negated numerical advantage. If they were allowed to use those tactics, if doctrine permitted what necessity demanded, the diplomatic situation deteriorated through October. Soviet demands escalated beyond what any sovereign nation could accept. Territory, basing rights, effective military control of Finland's strategic depth. The negotiations were theatre. Everyone understood that. Stalin had decided what he wanted, and Finland's willingness to negotiate peacefully simply didn't factor into his calculations. Lahti watched the political maneuvering with growing dread. War was coming, and Finland wasn't ready, not because its soldiers lacked courage or its weapons were inadequate, but because doctrine and reality remained fundamentally misaligned. The High Command still thought in terms of linear defense, holding ground, trading space for time. The Suomi demanded different thinking, aggressive ambush tactics, strike from concealment, inflict maximum casualties, and withdraw before the enemy could respond with overwhelming force. He'd built a weapon for a war the generals didn't want to acknowledge Finland would have to fight. Lieutenant Erkki Virtanen, recently assigned to one of the Suomi-equipped ski battalions, visited Tikkakoski in early November with detailed questions about cold weather maintenance. He was young, perhaps 25, with the lean build and weathered face of someone who'd spent winters in Lapland. "The men trust it now," Virtanen said, sitting across from Lahti in the small office overlooking the factory floor. After the first live-fire exercises, the skepticism disappeared. They've never had this kind of firepower available at close range. "And command?" Lahti asked. "Do they understand how to employ it?" Virtanen's expression answered before his words did. "Some do. The ones who fought in 18, who remember what close combat actually looks like." He paused. "Others still think we'll hold the Mannerheim line with rifle volleys at 400 meters. They're planning for a war that won't happen." "What will happen?" Lahti asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "The Russians will come in overwhelming numbers. We'll retreat to the forests. They'll follow." Virtanen spoke with the flat certainty of someone who'd already accepted what was coming. "And then we'll see if being right about tactics matters more than having perfect doctrine." The conversation haunted Lahti through the following weeks. He'd given Finland's soldiers a tool that could help them survive, perhaps even win against impossible odds. But tools alone weren't enough. You needed the will to use them correctly, the institutional flexibility to abandon comfortable assumptions when reality demanded it. On November 26th, the Soviet Union staged the Mainila incident. Artillery fire near the border, casualties blamed on Finnish provocation, the transparent pretext for war that no one believed but everyone recognized as the final diplomatic step before invasion. 4 days later, at 6:50 a.m. on November 30th, Soviet artillery opened fire across the length of the Finnish border. The initial reports were catastrophic. Soviet forces crossed the border in overwhelming strength at multiple points along the Karelian Isthmus and in the forests north of Lake Ladoga. Artillery bombardments that lasted hours, reducing frontier villages to ashen memory. Tank columns that Finnish anti-tank weapons, limited in number and mostly obsolete, could barely scratch. Air raids against cities that had no effective air defense. In the first 3 days, it looked like the war everyone had predicted. A small nation crushed under the weight of an empire that could afford to spend lives like artillery shells. But in the forests north of the isthmus, something unexpected was happening. Lieutenant Virtanen's ski platoon, 32 men armed with Suomis and intimate knowledge of terrain where they'd hunted since childhood, encountered a Soviet infantry column advancing along a narrow forest road 3 days into the war. The Russians numbered perhaps 200 men, supported by supply trucks and a few armored cars that couldn't maneuver off the packed snow of the road. Virtanen's men waited in positions they'd prepared during the autumn, concealed by snow and forest shadows, invisible to the advancing column. They let the first elements pass, let the Russians commit to the narrow defile, where the forest pressed close on both sides, where maneuver was impossible and retreat would be chaos. Then they opened fire. The Suomi's distinctive sound, that tearing canvas roar Lahti had heard 1,000 times on the range, erupted from multiple positions simultaneously. 71 rounds per magazine, sustained fire that didn't pause for reloading, delivered at ranges where accuracy mattered less than volume. The Soviet column disintegrated. Men died before they could unsling their rifles. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the chaos and the weapon fire. The armored cars tried to reverse, collided with supply trucks, created roadblocks that trapped the remaining infantry in a killing ground with no escape routes and no cover. Virtanen's platoon fired until their magazines were empty, reloaded with the spare drums they carried, fired again. Then they withdrew on skis, disappearing into forest, where wheeled vehicles couldn't follow, and pursuit on foot meant death from follow-up ambushes. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 7 minutes. Virtanen lost 2 men, one killed instantly, one wounded severely enough to require evacuation. The Soviet column ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The after-action report reached Lahti a week later, passed through channels by someone who thought he deserved to know. He read it 3 times, sitting alone in the workshop, while snow accumulated on the windows and the factory floor below ran triple shifts, producing more Suomis. The weapon had worked exactly as he'd envisioned. Better, perhaps, because he'd never quite believed that tactical theory would translate so directly to combat results. Virtanen's brief, factual description of the engagement contained within it the vindication Lahti had fought 20 years to achieve. Proof that his vision of close-quarter combat wasn't theory, but reality. That the Suomi gave Finnish soldiers tools to survive against impossible odds. But 2 men had died. The report didn't name them, didn't describe how they'd fallen or what their last moments had been like. They were statistics, necessary casualties in a defensive war Finland hadn't wanted but had no choice except to fight. Lahti felt their weight anyway. The pattern repeated across the front as December progressed. Soviet columns advancing through forests encountered Finnish ski troops, armed with Suomis, suffered catastrophic casualties, withdrew, or were destroyed. The tactic became formalized as motti, cutting enemy forces into isolated pockets and annihilating them piecemeal, using mobility and firepower to offset numerical disadvantage. The Battle of Suomussalmi in late December and early January became the defining example. Finnish forces numbering approximately 11,000 men faced 2 Soviet divisions, the 44th and 163rd, totaling over 45,000 troops. On paper, the outcome was inevitable. Soviet numbers, armor and artillery would overwhelm Finnish defensive positions, but paper didn't account for terrain, weather, or weapons designed specifically for conditions where conventional warfare became impossible. The Finns cut the Soviet columns into isolated segments, then attacked each segment with ski-mobile infantry carrying Suomis. The pattern was consistent. Approach to within meters under cover of forest and darkness, unleash overwhelming short-range firepower, withdraw before the enemy could organize effective response. Soviet soldiers, trained for open warfare with combined armed support, found themselves dying in forests where they couldn't see their attackers, killed by weapons that seemed to fire endlessly in the brief, brutal engagements that defined Finnish tactics. Captured Soviet documents, studied later, revealed the psychological impact. The The Finnish ghosts appear from nowhere with their automatic weapons. Our rifles freeze, theirs fire continuously. We cannot fight what we cannot see. Men are dying from fear as much as from bullets. Request immediate withdrawal or reinforcements with automatic weapons. But Stalin's orders didn't permit withdrawal, and Soviet industry hadn't prioritized submachine gun production because doctrine said they were wasteful, inaccurate, unsuitable for serious infantry work. The 44th and 163rd Divisions were effectively destroyed. Thousands killed, thousands more captured, equipment abandoned across miles of frozen forest. Finnish casualties were substantial. The Motti tactics demanded aggressive action that accepted risk. But the exchange ratio was unprecedented. Estimates suggested Soviet losses at 15 to 20 times Finnish casualties in the forest battles. Word spread through the Finnish military with the speed of salvation. The weapon Lahti had fought for, that generals had dismissed as a niche tool, was keeping Finland alive. Orders for Suomis increased exponentially. Factories worked around the clock. Soldiers who'd trained on bolt-action rifles had to learn a fundamentally different way of fighting. Aggressive, mobile, built around sustained firepower rather than aimed shots. But production couldn't match demand. Each Suomi required precision machining, skilled labor, time that soldiers dying on the front didn't have. Lahti found himself torn between pride and anguish. His creation was saving lives, proving decisive in engagements where conventional weapons would have failed, but there weren't enough of them. He thought about the unnamed casualties from Virtanen's first engagement, thought about all the Finnish soldiers still carrying bolt-action rifles, dying because factories couldn't produce Suomis fast enough, because procurement had limited orders, because doctrine had been slow to adapt. Being right felt heavier than he'd expected. The Winter War ended on March 13, 1940, with a peace treaty that felt like defeat, dressed in diplomatic language. Finland ceded 11% of its territory, including strategic positions along the Karelian Isthmus and around Lake Ladoga. Approximately 70,000 Finnish civilians had to abandon their homes, joining the thousands of war refugees, creating pressures that a nation of less than 4 million could barely absorb. But Finland survived as an independent nation. Against an enemy that had deployed nearly 500,000 troops, thousands of tanks, overwhelming air superiority, against odds that every military analyst had said made defense impossible, Finland had fought to a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender or occupation. The Suomi KP-31 had helped write that unlikely story, though the official histories would take years to fully acknowledge its role. The weapon had proven that innovative design combined with tactics suited to terrain and climate could offset enormous numerical disadvantages. Finnish ski troops armed with Suomis had inflicted casualties the Soviet High Command found difficult to explain to Stalin, losses that couldn't be blamed on weather alone or Finnish determination, but required acknowledging that Soviet doctrine had failed to adapt to conditions where conventional infantry tactics became death sentences. The ripple effects extended far beyond Finland's borders. Soviet weapons designers, humiliated by their losses and facing Stalin's rage at the war's unexpected difficulty, studied captured Suomis with obsessive attention. Within months, development began on what would become the PPSH-41, a submachine gun that incorporated many of Lahti's innovations. The drum magazine, though of different capacity, simplified blowback action, emphasis on reliability over refinement, design optimized for mass production and cold weather operation. By 1942, the Red Army was producing PPSH-41s at a rate that would have been unthinkable before the Winter War. The weapon that Soviet doctrine had dismissed as wasteful became standard equipment, with over 6 million units produced before war's end. Lahti's vision of close-quarter combat dominance, rejected by his own generals until necessity proved him right, became doctrine for the army that had invaded his country. Western military observers drew different lessons. The Suomi and the tactics it enabled proved that small, well-equipped forces using terrain intelligently could hold against overwhelming numbers, a strategic insight that would echo through asymmetric conflicts for decades. The weapon became a symbol of Finnish sisu, that untranslatable concept of stubborn determination against impossible odds, the refusal to accept defeat when rational calculation said resistance was futile. For Lahti, the recognition came too late and felt too heavy. He received honors, awards, professional acknowledgement of his engineering genius. The Finnish government finally ordered Suomis in the quantities he'd known were necessary, though by then the Peace of Moscow had ended the immediate threat, and production shifted toward preparing for conflicts everyone understood would eventually come. But Lahti rarely spoke about the Winter War in the years that followed. When pressed by journalists or historians, he would discuss metallurgy, spring tensions, feeding mechanisms, the technical problems he'd solved, the engineering challenges that had consumed 20 years of his life, about the weapon's human cost, about the lives it saved and the lives it took, about the 2 unnamed soldiers from Virtanen's first engagement and all the casualties that followed. He remained silent. Perhaps he understood something that victory celebrations and official histories couldn't capture, that creating efficient tools for killing carried a weight no amount of tactical justification could lift. He'd been right about what Finland needed, right about how close-quarter combat would define the war, right when institutional wisdom insisted he was wasting resources on an experimental dead end. Being right had saved his nation. It had also cost him something he couldn't quite name, some innocence about what it meant to give soldiers more effective ways to kill, even when those soldiers were defending their homes against invasion. The Suomi KP-31 remained in Finnish military service for decades, outlasting the designer who'd poured his life into its perfection. Museums preserve examples now as artifacts of engineering excellence and historical necessity. Collectors prize them for their craftsmanship and reliability. Veterans of the Winter War, when asked about the weapons they carried, speak of the Suomi with something close to reverence, not for its lethality, but for the confidence it gave them. The feeling that they had tools adequate to the impossible task of defending against an empire. But the weapons themselves are just metal and wood, mechanical assemblies functioning according to physical laws Lahti understood better than anyone. What endures beyond the museum displays and collector enthusiasm is the lesson he embodied, that innovation often comes from those willing to see past conventional wisdom, to trust their observations even when authorities insist they're wrong, to persist through failure and skepticism because they understand something essential that others have missed. He'd created a weapon that changed modern warfare's character, proving that overwhelming firepower could be packaged in portable, reliable form, that winter and forest could be allies rather than obstacles, that small nations could defend themselves if they armed their soldiers with tools designed for the actual war they'd fight, rather than the theoretical war doctrine preferred. In the quiet of his later years, Lahti must have held that knowledge against the weight of what it had cost. The soldiers who died waiting for weapons factories couldn't produce fast enough, the enemy casualties that tactics and firepower made inevitable, the burden of being the mind behind a weapon that proved decisive precisely because it made killing more efficient. In the end, it wasn't the weapon that endured. It was the stubborn vision of a blacksmith's son who refused to accept that Finland's soldiers should die with inadequate tools simply because tradition said submachine guns were temporary aberrations. Lahti had seen the future of close-quarter combat and built it with his hands, round by round, test by test, failure by failure, until he got it right. And in getting it right, he saved a nation that hadn't believed him until the snow ran red and the forests echoed with the sound of 900 rounds per minute, keeping darkness at bay. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. If you invented something that changed war, would that be victory or burden?